Let me thank our speaker, Dr. Gmonju Abiri, who has graciously accepted to lead today's discourse on wellness, leveraging loneliness. Dr. Abiri is a consultant psychiatrist. She is also a psychologist. She's an EAP practitioner, a wellness enthusiast. She's also an associate lecturer at the Lagos State Teaching Hospital. Gmonju, as I fondly call her, or Princess, it's one of the people I'm proud to call my mentee, although most times we do reverse mentoring. She's also my mentor. I thank everybody that has joined us today. This is Sages and Scribes Connect and Learn series, a monthly learning event being led today by Dr. Gmonju Abiri. Over to you, Dr. Abiri. Thank you very much for accepting to lead this discourse.
All right, good morning. A very good morning to you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gmonju Abiri. I have been very well introduced by the very right Reverend himself, who is my friend, my mentor, my father, many other things wrapped into one. I feel very honored and very delighted to be given this opportunity. Today's conversation has been, well, rightly introduced by Reverend. Today's topic is one that I very much consider very apt for our time. Apt in the sense that there's so much going on all over the world, locally and globally. Of course, we'll come to those conversations, but I'd like to start locally from Nigeria. I say it is apt for this time because in Nigeria, we just concluded this presidential elections and we're about to go in for the gubernatorial elections as well. And a lot of conversation has come out of presidential elections. I've heard people say to each other face to face and even virtually how it is that they are disappointed in their choice of candidate, how it is that they feel slighted, that their values as friends do not align, and how many people have actually come out to say that, well, following the election, they will be, shedding off their friend load, largely because they couldn't, come to a table to understand the differences as to whether or not one candidate was better than the other. A patient of mine actually said to me that she honestly could not believe that anyone in their sane minds could vote for one of the candidates. I would leave that to you to guess which candidate is that, but of course your guess is as good as mine. So good morning everyone, and yes, welcome to the conversation today, mental wellness, leveraging isolation and loneliness. We can go on to the next slide, and I just brought this up, say that this is one of the possible attendant effects of isolation and loneliness. And so this client shows up in my therapy room and I asked the question, so the problem is that you easily fall in love, and after many days, months, years of loneliness and isolation, my client says to me, yes, my love. For me, it's one of the attendant effects of loneliness. Let us go on as we look at what the conversation today will be about. I'm hopeful that at the end of this conversation, I would like very much, yes. So at the end of today's session, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to see mental health issues through the eyes of others. I want us to know that we are all in this together. I would like us to look at the concepts of health and wellness, to discuss the concept of isolation and loneliness, including risk factors, to look at the physical and mental health implications of isolation and loneliness. I want us to look at the power in social connectedness. I would like that we leverage on isolation and loneliness. And of course, remember that we are all in this together. If there's time, we will take a mindfulness exercise, which is something that we should learn to do when we are alone and isolated from other people. And so as we go on, I would like to, of course, say that I always like to give a disclaimer when I'm talking about real life. The reason why I have shared these stories is to be able to help us see health issues, specifically mental health issues, through the eyes of others, so that it just doesn't look like, oh, it's somebody's story, it's another person's story. These things happen to people like you and I. I often always say as well that if any of the stories here on the call bear a semblance to you or anyone that you might know, it is purely coincidental, and that the cases have been put forward purely for knowledge sake. If anyone, of course, feels traumatized or you might need to speak to a therapist, remember, it's one of the reasons why I am in the room today. So let us go on as we look at mental health issues through the eyes of others. We'll be looking at 5 case studies. Next slide, please, as we look at case study 1. Case study 1 has us looking at E, a 35-year-old single business executive who had been doing great on the job, received multiple promotions since commencing work. During the COVID-19 pandemic, E lost his father in the early hours of the 4th of April 2020 during the lockdown. Later that evening, on the same day, E received a call that his mother had also passed on. Reality struck when E recalled that he couldn't make the mandatory same-day burials as he was far away in Canada in the middle of a lockdown. And not only was he in a foreign land, he was left to grapple with the loneliness of the lockdown and have to grieve alone as well. And so some of the stories we'll be looking at today will show us the real life impact, of course, of isolation and loneliness. Let's move on to case study 2. And case study 2, of course, has us looking at the next client. The next client here is PE. PE, a 25-year-old business coach, unarguably one of the best in his field, extremely passionate, full of life and energy, and detailed almost to a fault. If your business went through PE, you could rest assured that it will thrive. PE presented to me a few weeks ago at the clinic, and his complaints were, "Doc, I'm afraid of living this life. Putting up appearances like all is well. I am so lonely. Work is my only escape. Pressure is too much, Doc. I feel like ending it all." Another individual who was vulnerable and open enough to tell us that they were indeed lonely. Let us move on to case study 3. And with case study 3, the individual that we're looking at here is SO, a 45-year-old single, charming, focused, and top management executive at a consulting firm. SO had been feeling successful over the past few years as life had indeed been good. SO had grown in leaps and bounds in the career side of life. 2 years ago, during the COVID time, the bubble burst and reality hit. What have I been doing with my life? I am single at 45 years, no children, family ties are strained, and I have no friend. No one gets me. Absolutely no one. Let us look at case study 4. And with case study 4, the individual story that we are looking at is OT, another 25-year-old support IT worker, just relocated to America following a new job offer. Sees this job opportunity as one for a better life and to permanently cut all ties from his dependent parents and family members. He refuses to pick up their calls or reply to their text messages. "They've been sucking all of me since I graduated and started working," OT said. "Enough of all that black tack and urgent 2K. A man has got to leave and start to define his life away from relatives." And OT says, as his parting word, last, everybody will be all right. Now let's look at case study 5, which is the last that we'll be looking at today. And case study 5 look at the case of Theo. She says, "My name is Theo, Doc. I can't recall my age. I can't even do the math. Her husband says to me, the situation has worsened over the past 5 years, Doc. All the children have left the house. The empty nest syndrome. She refused any domestic staff, family, friends, or family members. She does not attend any social functions or religious events. Her memory and her physical health have increasingly gotten worse. These days, she believes that we are under attack by aliens." 5 stories, 5 case studies, 5 real-life experiences about how individuals like you and I in Nigeria and even abroad are coming face to face with the issues of loneliness and isolation. Let us move on quickly to the next slide as I remind us that we are all in this together. And we are all in this together from local to global, from relationships with ourselves, to relationships with our spouses, to relationships with our children, to relationships with our family members, to relationships at church, at work, in the larger community. A lot of us are lonely. A lot of us are isolated. And I will make a case for isolation and loneliness as I start from the good book that says that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And while God was creating, he looked at man and said, "It is not good that man should be alone." So even the Bible, which is the good book I was referring to, actually said, there's something about loneliness. I don't want man to be alone. And so I would make him a helpmate. Now let's look at Aristotle. Aristotle talked about us being social beings. Aristotle is one of the fathers of medicine. And Aristotle says that we are social beings. We are born with an innate capacity for forming social connection. And from childhood till adulthood, we continue to need personal and emotional development. Of course, we also need social connections to do everything that we need to every day. The pillars of wellness, which we will look at shortly, also speaks to social wellness. And so beyond an individual telling you, "Oh, I don't have a headache, I don't have this, I'm well," Are you really well when you say that you are well? Or are you just physically well and you think that that trumps everything else? Definition of health as well by the World Health Organization does not make light of the fact about the role of social wellness. And so we'll come to that in a minute. Mental health as well, the definition of mental health has us saying that an individual can only say that they are mentally healthy when they can successfully perform the functions of the mind. But beyond that is that they must also learn to have thriving relationships with other people apart from themselves and apart from the people that they are comfortable with. Let us move on to the next slide as we see the definition of health by the WHO. And the definition of health says that health is not just, I don't have a headache, I don't have catarrh, praise God Almighty, I haven't been to the hospital for the past 10 years. That does not mean that you are well. Health is not just the absence of disease or infirmity, but a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. Let us move on to the next slide as we look at what wellness is and what the pillars of wellness are. And wellness, of course, looks at an individual's ability to successfully perform the functions of their lives. And so this individual has thriving relationships. They're able to cope with the normal stresses of life. They're able to achieve productivity in the things that they do, and they can contribute their own quota to the environment that they live in. Pillars of wellness, as we know it, are 8. Physical wellness that has to do with our body, what we eat, how we sleep, whether we exercise or not. Emotional, of course, has to do with our state of our emotions and our mind. Social, again, which is something that we're sitting on today, has to do with our relationships, not just with other people, but with ourselves as well. And of course, it has to do with us having thriving, adaptive relationships. Occupational speaks to the jobs that we do. Financial, of course, talks about the money. Everybody likes to talk about money and everybody likes to have money. Spiritual talks about our relationship with a higher being. Whatever it is that we have decided and chosen is higher than us. Intellectual speaks to our mind, how we are renewing our minds, how we are developing our minds. And for instance, of course, this conversation today and every other conversation that Sages and Scribes brings on the Connect and Learn series speaks to our intellectual wellness. And last but not the least is the environmental, where we live, whether we feel comfortable where we live, and whether or not the environment suits our health and well-being. Let's move on to the next slide as I ask a question. And the question is, how many social media platforms are you on? So at this point, I'm going to pause and I want everyone on the call today to respond in the chat box. How many social media platforms are you on? We're going to do an average. You can mention them, but I would like the number in this day and age. And so from the oldest person in this room, I'm not going to assume who the oldest is, to the youngest person, how many social media platforms are you on? I will put my response in the chat while I wait for everyone else to try and put their responses. Okay, so the numbers are coming in. Thank you. Some people actually did write them out. Thank you. So I'm seeing numbers oscillate between as little as 2 to as high as 7. And if you are on no social media platform, please feel free to also put it there. So the numbers are going on. The mode appears to be 4. The lowest number again is 2. I haven't seen none, and some as high as 7. Thank you. Thank you very much. And so we can see that an average individual, either young or old, will be on at least 3 social media platforms. And I'm sure that somebody somewhere is wondering, why are we asking how many social media platforms? What does that have to do with the conversation today? And I will tell you, it has plenty to do with the conversation. And when I say plenty, I want us to know that it is among the tragic ironies of life, modern life, that people have never had so many ways to connect. And so imagine that, for instance, Charity Tony Uba has 8 social media platforms. Andrew Dagon has 4. Yomi Abolaji has 1. Tosin Oluboye has 3. Aniel Venusia has 7. But regardless of how many social media platforms we are on and having so many ways to connect, in this age and time, a lot of us actually feel disconnected. In fact, research has shown that people have never been this lonely as a time like this. And so I would say that while some of us may be lonely as a result of chance, some of us are actually lonely as a result of choice. In a world of over 7.5 billion people, many of us feel entirely lonely, which is a high price to our mental health. The last numbers they came in, 6, 5, 3, somebody said 37. I want to assume perhaps it's an error, but just in case it's not an error, maybe when we're done, you can educate us as to so many social media platforms. Let's move on to the next slide. And I want us to look at the burden of loneliness. Loneliness can be a burden. To some of us, it's just a word. To some of us, it's a concept. But to some people, to the people who know it, who feel it very deeply, it can be a burden. Loneliness is the distressing feeling of being alone or separated. It can cause physical and mental health problems. And sometimes what we have found is that the presence of disease can actually be a risk factor for loneliness. It would interest you to know that in the UK, there is a minister for loneliness. And that minister for loneliness was appointed early in 2018 by Theresa May, who at the time saw the sad reality of modern life affecting millions of people, following evident feelings of isolation. 1 in 4 Americans admit to the fact that they are lonely, that they do not have close friends and families who understand them. In Asia, the numbers are increasing. They've increased from 16% to 30% as older adults keep complaining that they are beginning to become more lonely. Nigeria, of course, is not left behind. As in Nigeria, loneliness has been documented, especially amongst older adults. Loneliness is an emerging public health crisis. And while people understand that loneliness can be a problem, few of us realize the severity of its effects. I want us to look at the slide that is currently projected. And I'm hoping that, somebody knows the name of this movie. If someone is able to correctly guess the name of this movie, I might be willing to share a prize. In this movie, there was a quote. I watched this movie about 4 years ago, but I never forgot this quote because it had to do with racism, stigma, discrimination. And the quote said, "The world is full of lonely people afraid to make the first move." And I want to ask you today, ask yourself, am I lonely? Am I alone and lonely, or am I alone but not lonely? Remember that loneliness itself is not a problem, but loneliness can become a problem when you feel distressed about being alone or separated, or when you feel like there are not enough people to understand you or support you when you go through a difficult time. No one has guessed the name of the movie, and so let us move on to the next slide. The movie, by the way, is titled The Green Book, and so I get to keep my prize. Next slide, please. As we then move on to the burden of isolation. 7.5 billion people in the world, and yet a lot of people are isolated. What does that tell us? It tells us that isolation itself is another public health crisis. Isolation, of course, is the lack of social contacts and also having few people to interact with regularly. You can live alone but not feel lonely or socially isolated. And you can be lonely even when you are with other people. Remember, loneliness has to do with a distressing, subjective feeling. A lot of people in this day and age are socially isolated. A few years ago, I saw 2 patients whose stories I would share. And those 2 patients, one of them said to me, "Doc, I'm so used to people. I get anxious when I need to travel and nobody goes with me. I always sponsor a friend to go with me. How do you think I can help myself?" And I said, "The next time you are going on a trip, you will go by yourself." He shouted, "Ah, but doctor, that's the problem." And I said, "Yes, but therein lies the solution. You need to learn to enjoy your own company. Listen to music, take a walk, swim, exercise, do it for yourself." And he came back to say that it was one of the best pieces of advice he ever received in his life. The second patient story I want to share is that of a 90-year-old woman who was left to live alone in Lagos. Her children were abroad for greener pastures and, of course, taking care of their own families. They had left their mother in care of a domestic help, who they did not know that the mother had chased out of the house, by the way. And the mother then decided to go on a fast. She went on a really long fast. By the time they brought her to the hospital, she weighed barely 30 kilograms. She was on the verge of death. She was socially isolated. And while she was rich in children, with children all over the world, there was no one who could help and support her in her difficult moments. And so social isolation can be a burden. Let's move on to the next slide as we look at some of the problems with social isolation. People who are likely to be socially isolated are those who may have found themselves unexpectedly isolated due to illnesses, separation from family or friends, the death of a loved one, those who have lost mobility or the ability to move, those who live alone, those who have limited social support, those who have hearing problems, and those who also have language barriers as well. And so when social isolation and loneliness happen, it can impact negatively on our physical health and our mental health as well. Some of the concerns or the conditions that may arise when it affects our physical health include things like high blood pressure, also known as hypertension, heart disease, obesity, a weakened immune system, anxiety, depression, and even death. Mental health problems that can result include depression, anxiety, a low self-esteem, a low perception of self and skills, sleep problems, eating problems, increased stress, cognitive decline, and even Alzheimer's disease. It might interest us to know that loneliness is being put at par with problems, physical health problems such as smoking of cigarettes and obesity. And so loneliness is a big deal. Again, we understand that loneliness can be tough, but we may not understand the big problems that loneliness and isolation may cause in our age and time. Let us move on to the next slide as we then look at this song. So again, this is another opportunity to win a gift. If anyone is able to tell me the word, or the musician who sang this song before I finish reading it to us, I owe the individual a gift. Loneliness is always looking for a friend. It found me once and it has been around since then. Loneliness is never waiting by the door. It sweeps right through and it will never be ignored. And so even in the musical world, we can see that somebody somewhere, thank you, somebody has said Westlife. I have some either, Gen Ys or Gen Zs or, well, those of us who are still young, regardless of our ages. Yes, artist is Westlife and the song title is Loneliness Knows Me by Name. The wordings are deep because it says loneliness never waits by the door. Once it gets a foot in, it would sweep right in and it can never be ignored. Let us go to the next slide as we then look at what today I will want to describe as the power of social connectedness. The power of physical and social connectedness. There's a talk by a doctor known as Dr. Kelly McGonigal. She's a psychologist. It's a TEDx talk, and it's one of the most watched TEDx talks ever. It's been watched over 30 million times. The title of that talk is How to Make Stress Your Friend. I'm sure someone here is wondering, how do you make stress your friend? Stress is a bad guy, but not always. Stress is actually our body's normal response to, distress or anything that we find threatening. And so one of the things that Kelly McGonigal said in that talk is that there is power in physical touch. A lot of people felt distressed during the COVID pandemic when they couldn't touch people. In fact, I remember seeing a documentary where relatives came to the hospital to see their loved ones, and through a nylon barrier, they had made hands and allowed them to hug each other. Being able to hold ourselves, you can see I'm giving myself a hug, or hold somebody else, encourages our bodies to release that hormone known as oxytocin. It's the cuddle hormone. And of course, that just tells us that physical and social connectedness has its many benefits. And so let's look at some of what the benefits are. The first one I want us to look at, next slide, is what is called the concept of Ubuntu. Again, when I spoke earlier, I had spoken about how it is that as social beings, we need other people. No man is an island. Our lives are incomplete when we leave them by ourselves. And so the richness of life comes when we have other people in our lives, when we are able to impact other people, and when we are able to leave a mark. And that's where the concept of Ubuntu comes from. Ubuntu says that I am because we are. And so my life is richer because you are in it. Your life is richer because I am in it. But much more importantly is that being able to care for another person through their difficult moments, through their difficulties and their hard times, actually creates resilience for us. In caring for others, we're able to see life through the eyes of others, hear things through their ears, feel through their bodies, And also understand that bad things don't happen to bad people only. We all have difficult times. And when those difficult times come, it's important that we have other people to share it with. Let's move on to the next slide and we look at the concept of volunteering. Volunteering is another powerful tool that looks at the power of social and physical connectedness. And I have a quote here that says, volunteers do not necessarily have the time. They just have the heart. There's beauty in volunteering. And the quote that I like to drop after talking about the beauty in volunteering is how that your life may never be fuller, your life may never be meaningful if you have not done something every day for somebody who can never repay you. There is joy in giving, there's joy in sharing of ourselves. Most times when people hear that share of yourselves, they're thinking of, they want me to give money. No, you can share of your time, your ideas, and so many other things that you have. Let's move on to the next slide as we look at the third point on physical and social connectedness. And I wrote it here, join a club. Join a club or a class that will teach you how to draw, that will teach you music, gardening, exercise. Join a book club, register to swim, register to dance. Sharing life with other people is beautiful. Living life alone can be good, but it's not as beautiful as sharing life with other people. And so the beauty in social connectedness and physical connectedness as well. Someone said join a Rotary Club. I don't know. I'll probably say join church or something. But whatever you find fulfilling and makes you happy, please join it. Please do it. Let's move on to the next slide. As we again look at another concept, this time the concept of what I would call, let us guess this song and the artist. Lonely, I'm Mr. Lonely. I have nobody to call my own. Again, lonely, I am Mr. Lonely. I have nobody to call my own. Thank you very much, Akon, Lonely. Again, of course, this is to help us understand that even in music, in art, in spiritual matters, in religious things, loneliness has been identified and it's something that we must never take for granted. Let us move on to the next slide as we again look at another concept that has to look at how it is that it is beautiful when we have physical and social connectedness. And I said, be it a person, a pet, or a plant, please give life to something that has life. And so if you decide to buy a new plant, which is a hobby that I'm, beginning to take on these days, I just want to keep buying another plant after another plant and giving it life, watering it, watching it grow, yes, and removing the weeds, or a pet, or an individual in whose life you want to invest. Give life to something else other than yourself. And you will see how gratifying it is for you. You will feel happier, more satisfied, and better at the end of the day with yourself. Let's look at another concept on how it is that we can also feel physical connectedness. And I said here that we should engage in shared mindful gratitude. Gratitude is a concept that we're beginning to talk about quite a lot. But beyond saying the things that you are grateful for, mindful gratitude has to do with not just listing out the things that you're grateful for, but telling us why you are grateful for those things. And I want to take it a step higher by saying, share mindful gratitude. Look for your spouse, a friend, a loved one, and sit down and tell them, oh, this is what I am grateful for, and this is why I am grateful for these things. It's beautiful. It makes you see life through the lens of another person and helps you understand that some of the things that you wouldn't even count as blessings are actually blessings for somebody else. I said it here, it's a quote, that gratitude turns what we have into enough. And gratitude is a powerful catalyst for happiness. We know that song that says, count your blessings, name them one by one. And it will surprise you, of course, what God has done. There's so much to be grateful for. There's so much to be thankful for. And even in all the chaos that life can be sometimes, there's always something to be thankful for. Now let's move on to the next one. And the concept is one that the Zulu people call Sawabona. And Sawabona says, I see you. The power of physical and social connectedness encourages us to see people, I once read this book titled, If I Could Tell You One Thing. And the book is a compilation of different people who were interviewed by the author. And the first person who was interviewed was Bill Clinton. And they said, tell us one thing. And Bill Clinton said, see people. Really see people. Beyond the work that people do for you, beyond the errands that they run for you, who are they? What are their names? What are their struggles? What are they going through? There's no one in this life who you would connect with, who you would encourage to do better, to be better. See them, see their struggles, see their joy, see their pain, but honestly see people. And of course, when you see people, people will also see you too. So that's another beauty of physical connectedness as well. The last point I want to talk about on physical connectedness has to do with talking to a therapist. I mean, this conversation will not be enough if I don't encourage us to speak about our issues and our problems when we have them. And I always say that everybody needs a therapist. Even a therapist needs a therapist. Oh, Nigeria is Nigerian. Let's talk to a therapist. Oh, I'm having these issues and problems at my job. Let's talk to a therapist, or let's speak to the employee assistance professional at the workplace. But we always all need someone to talk to have open and honest conversations that are free of bias, non-judgmental, and are extremely confidential. Talk to someone. It lightens the load. Many people I have spoken to always end up saying, I never knew that I actually needed someone to talk to. And so this conversation has been so lifting for me. Please find someone to talk to. Let us move on to the next slide. And I want us to look at the conversation today, leveraging loneliness and social isolation. We can see the iRobot sitting down there. And, I see the iRobot and I'm saying, well, this is the future. And the future is already here. We're already having robots take our orders at restaurants, serve us food. We're having robots, AI on the other end of the, computer doing things for us. And I just want to say that loneliness and social isolation are actually not entirely bad. We must understand that we can leverage on this seemingly two concepts that people will probably look at as negative because, oh, they're so lonely. Oh, this person is isolated. And I think one of the first steps that we can use to know how we can leverage loneliness and isolation is to first of all look out for people who may be lonely or who may be isolated, including ourselves. Is it productive? Is it for a reason? Is it for a season? Or is it something that has become the norm for that individual over and over again? We must listen to other people when they tell us, when they share from a deep place. It's so difficult to tell people when you have problems. So when people tell you they have problems, please genuinely listen, not just out of curiosity, but out of care and concern. A young man reached out to me on Instagram yesterday and he said, Dr. Bonju, I've always heard about people taking their lives by suicide, but a neighbor beside my house just came home from work yesterday, frustrated with life. He had not been paid salary for 2 months. He got a girl pregnant. The relatives were not having it. And he just got home and he took a poisonous substance and that was the end. Let us listen in a kind, compassionate, and non-judgmental manner. Let us learn about loneliness and social isolation. And so, yes, like most things in life, it can have good sides, it can have positive and negative sides, but let's learn what is important, take it and work with it. And the last but not the least is that if and when we find people who struggle, people who don't understand that their loneliness is a big deal or is impacting on them negatively, let us by all means link them with sources of support. And those sources of support may be friends, maybe family members, maybe pastors, maybe imams. These sources of support may even be a professional like myself or other psychologists, some of whom are on the call. Let us link people up when they need help. Let us move on to the next slide as we look at how, again, we can leverage loneliness and social isolation. I'm currently reading this book titled Ikigai. And in the book, there's a form of therapy titled the Morita therapy. In fact, when I saw the therapy, I was like, wow, I need this therapy. Therapy was popularized by a man known as Shoma Morita. And one of the things that therapy does is that it teaches us the therapeutic benefits of loneliness. Morita therapy teaches us how to accept our feelings And he also encourages us to do what we should be doing. There's a lot of distraction in the world right now. And what Morita therapy does is that Morita therapy lasts for between 15 and 21 days. And out of those 15 and 21 days, a significant amount of time is spent alone, isolated, away from phones, family, laptops. I'm sure somebody on the call is thinking, how will I survive? No phone, no laptop. I mean, we've become so accustomed to these things that we can't even imagine our lives without all of these things. But therapy, this kind of therapy is needed. And you would find out why we will need this kind of therapy because of its healthful benefits on the next slide. This next conversation has me looking at the conversation in the book. Next slide, please. Yes, this slide. The book titled Deep Work. Deep Work was written by a man known as Cal Newport. And what Cal Newport has come to understand, like many of us have come to understand, is that we should learn to spend time alone from the noise and distractions from the madding crowd. Deep work is a term that is used to describe professional activities that are performed in a state of distraction-free concentration. And we'll be surprised when we turn off everything else except ourselves and our minds, that we are able to push our cognitive capacities to the limit. In his book, Deep Work, Cal Newport talks about a few people that I have highlighted here. He talks about much more people, but of course, I've highlighted just a few. And the first one is a psychiatrist by the name Carl Jung. Carl Jung, in his time, built a tower of stones in the woods to promote deep work in his life. And though he had a lot of patients who wanted to see him, he also gave himself a lot of time for rest, refreshment, and reinvigoration. The next person on this list is Michel de Montaigne, a 16th century essay writer who worked in a private library. He built the private library in a part of his apartment where no one could reach. The third person in this conversation is Mark Twain. And a number of us might know Mark Twain from some of the quotes that he has said, that familiarity breeds contempt and children. And when Mark Twain wrote the book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain was on a property in a farm in New York, where he spent most of his summer. And when he was there, he was so isolated from the main house that whenever they wanted to get his attention to call him for lunch, for breakfast, or for dinner, they would need to blow a trumpet to get his attention to come to the main house. Deep work was what he was doing. The next person is Woody Allen, and Woody Allen is a screenwriter and director. And in 44 years, Woody Allen wrote and directed 44 movies. In other words, a movie per year, or at least that's how I did the math. And out of these 44 movies, 23 of them received Academy Award nominations. That's what we know. But what we do not know is that while Woody Allen was doing this absurd rate of artistic productivity, throughout the period, he never owned a computer, and instead, he was typing from a German Olympian typewriter. He's not the only one who has lived his life free from social media distractions of the modern day and age. There's also Peter Higgs, a theoretical physicist who worked in such undisconnectedness that when he won a Nobel Prize, journalists could not find him for many days because there was no way to reach him. It was away from the rest of the world. Of course, there's also J.K. Rowling, who we might know from the popular series Harry Potter novel. She uses a computer, but she's not very active on social media. And so in 2019, her staff opened a social media Twitter account for her. And 1.5 years later, after they opened that social media account, she came out and she said, well, yeah, so this is the real me. However, you will not be hearing from me often because pen and paper is my priority at the moment. I want us to also look at Bill Gates. And Bill Gates, of course, is the Microsoft CEO. Microsoft CEO Bill Gates takes 2 times off in the year. And he calls them think weeks where he goes to think, when he isolates himself to a lakeside cottage to do absolutely. And the last person is Neil Stevens, a cyber pro guy who told us so much about the internet, but who by himself does not use a lot of the internet. While we isolate, we are lonely, we can leverage it to do deep work. A lot of us are distracted by phone notifications, phone calls, people coming in, going out, and we sometimes need to shut out all of those distractions from our lives to get the best. There are days I want to go out and I say, today, I'm not going to take my phone. I'm going to leave my phone at home. Whatever calls will come in. Or there are days that I'm working and I'm like, I should have finished this work 1 hour ago. All these phone calls are just rather distracting. And I just, turn off the phone. We should learn to unplug from the world so that we can do the best that we can. Let us move on to the next slide and see whether or not there are benefits of isolating and leveraging on loneliness. And yes, there definitely are. It improves productivity. You're able to do more. In fact, you're able to tap into areas of your mind where you would never have thought you could get to. It improves self-awareness and self-regulation, which are key skills for emotional intelligence. Spending time with yourself, which a lot of us don't even do. A lot of us can't even afford to spend time with ourselves because we've given ourselves, away to a lot of people. Again, it comes with many of our territories, but we must never leave ourselves behind. It increases empathy. Empathy, of course, for yourself and of course for other people, because you also learn new things about yourself and new things about other people in your time of introspection. It helps us to build mental strength and resilience. And so we are able to tap into deep parts of our minds. We're able to see strength in ways that we never even knew that we could get. A quote by Marianne Williamson says, our greatest fear is not that we're not strong enough. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. And many times we need to be in the quiet place to understand how, powerful we surely are, that we have a lot of light and that our darkness should not keep us quiet. Being alone and leveraging on loneliness and isolation teach us to be mindful of ourselves, of our time, of the people that we give access to us, of the things that we need to do and the things we actually should get done, like in Morita's therapy. It encourages us to use our imagination and to daydream. It encourages us to develop problem-solving and decision-making skills. And one of the best things about spending time alone is that you are able to recharge, to refuel, and of course, at the end of the day, you get rejuvenated. I talk about whether or not isolation and loneliness should be worried about. And I know that when I started speaking earlier, one of the things I'd said is, regardless of how a tool is, it would have good sides and maybe not so great sides. And so should we worry when we notice that some people are constantly, perpetually in a state of isolation and loneliness? For balance, it is important to reiterate that loneliness and isolation can also be detrimental for individuals who it continues to increase in intensity, frequency, and causes distress to their functioning in terms of their personal life, where it affects their quality of life, their occupational pursuits, or building and maintaining relationships with other people. Loneliness and isolation can be good tools. They can be useful tools, but they can also be detrimental tools if used poorly, especially when we remember that relationships are the fabric of human existence. Let us move on to the next slide. And when we started, one of my, slides said that we are all in this. And when I say that we are all in this together, it is not for doom or for gloom. With all of the information shared and accessed here today, I am hopeful that we are more educated, informed, and equipped to handle isolation and loneliness. One of the biggest problems that people who live in Nigeria have to grapple with, places like Canada, the UK, where everybody else is minding their own business and looking straight ahead, is loneliness. If you are aware of it, remember the 4 L's I talked about, learn about it, look out for it, listen, and then link up. If you are aware about loneliness and you know that, loneliness can be difficult, but it can also be, energizing to the individual, you are more likely to be able to do better. And so I'm hopeful, yes, that with the conversation today, we're all more educated, informed, and equipped to handle loneliness and isolation in such a way that it will not be detrimental to either our physical or our mental health, and that instead we will be able to use it to the best of our functioning. Next slide, please. As I close, I'd like to share that one of the most essential ingredients to our mental well-being, wellness, mental health. In this day and age, it's so difficult to want to live our own lives and not remember that someone somewhere needs us, or someone somewhere can benefit from something that we have. It's such a selfish world. And while there's nothing wrong with being self, life could actually be more richer, fuller, lovelier, and more refreshing if we shared our time, our lives, and our resources with other people. Whenever we talk about kindness, we often talk about gifting kindness to other people. And while I am not against that, please show kindness to other people. Never leave the most important person behind. Kindness is the cornerstone of our collective mental health. It is intentional that the picture here, is that of the handsome Wakanda man who, when he was going through the toughest moments of his life, still gave us the very best of him. Unfortunately, the world came at him. They tore him apart. They said, oh, he looked really frail because he was doing drugs. Oh, he looked really terrible, maybe because he was desperate for a role. What we all did not know was that he was struggling. And so as I close, I want to say to us today that please be kind. For everyone you know, for everyone you meet, is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Take time to spend time with yourself. Get to know yourself better. Learn to love and enjoy your own company, improve on your self-esteem, your self-perception, your self-confidence. And of course, at the end of the day, you would find that you would attract even bigger and better opportunities. It doesn't cost much to be kind. And so please, go on today and decide to use loneliness and isolation to the best, to the maximum, but also learn to be kind. As I close, next slide. I'd like to thank you very much, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, for your time, your rapt attention, and for being an amazing audience. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.